Kia ora. Hello. This week, we will be looking at another of those lesser known events of the late medieval period. My favourite. We are discussing the crisis of feudalism. While sounding relatively benign, this is one of those pivotal events that had lasting impact on the fabric of late medieval society and by extension, the creation of early modern society. The crisis of feudalism is considered to be part of the crisis of the late Medieval Ages, which we are creating a series for. If you've not watched any of our previous episodes in the series, I suggest you do so, as this will help this episode make more sense. I've included a link to the playlist about here and down below with our usual sources. This episode, I'm going to discuss what the medieval crisis of feudalism was and how this event began the decline of the landed aristocracy in Europe and the dissolution of feudalism and the rise of capitalism in its wake. I'm Andrew, and this is Populaurbanum, a show where we discuss reenactment and the medieval middle class. So, what was the crisis of feudalism? Well, we'll get there, but before we do, as usual, we need to discuss the what before we discuss the why. So, let's briefly discuss feudalism and the conditions that led to the crisis for some context. Prior to the 14th century, an estimated 80% of Europe's population was engaged as an agricultural worker under feudalism. They would provide rent to their feudal lord, usually in the form of a surplus of grains from their harvest or a cash rent. These feudal lords consisted of both the landed gentry and the church. During the 12th and 13th centuries, there was a great expansion of both city-states and new farmlands. The farms were created through the efforts of logging and the draining of swamps. This is known as the Great Clearances. Man, they have names for everything, don't they? Is during the 12th century, we see a great population boom for the great landowners. This meant an increase of wealth through increased rents, as there was a greater agricultural returns. The landed gentry used this wealth to splash out on increased luxury items and to fund their wars. The height of this was during the 12th century, which funnily enough coincided with the 12th century Renaissance. I wonder why. During the late 13th century, Europe was suffering an issue with inflation and stagnant wages, and we've talked about this before. As I've mentioned in my previous videos, the majority of wealth was locked in the hands of the elites. These elites were the feudal lords, wealthy merchants, and the urban patrician elites. For the feudal lords, this was a major risk, as they derived their incomes from two sources: the extractions of rent and the spoils gained from the participation of war. The feudal lords were not interested in investing in the development of agricultural or markets or innovation, but instead spending their wealth on maintaining their lifestyle. The only way for them to increase their income was to have more farmland, and with more tenant farmers working on that land to extract rent and more taxes. The expansion of the farmlands was at a maximum. Productivity was starting to slump, thus making it difficult to extract as much wealth from the land they once had. To maintain their incomes, the feudal lords began to apply more pressure on the peasants. They increased rents and they tried to keep wages low. This meant the peasants could not maintain a surplus beyond that of a subsistence lifestyle. This came to a head during the 14th century, beginning with the Great European Famine of 1317. This was not only having the effect of starving the population, but also impacting the aristocracy by severely cutting their primary form of income, that of rents derived from agricultural trade. Never mind the fact that revenues had been declining since the middle of the 13th century by this point. This led to a reduction of income of the cities who relied on trade from the country. So too did the tax revenues of the state because of this contraction. As the medieval economy slowly began to recover, Europe was struck again by that most insidious of things, the mortality of the Black Death. Since the basis of feudalism relied on an agrarian society, especially one of low wages and high rents to maintain the economy, the post-Black Death economy saw the opposite occurring. Because of the reduction of the labour force, wages were high and available land was plentiful, so rents had to reduce. Peasants started to agitate for better wages. Revolutions such as the Peasants Revolt and the Jacquerie were attempts to break free of the burdens of feudalism. And although the aristocracy defeated these revolutions, the wages and the mobility of the peasants still increased. Unable to maintain their properties and lifestyle, let alone their wars, there was a shift from a reliance on the feudal system and instead a lessening of feudal obligations on those very peasants. Greater wages were paid. More lands were let out to common people. And because of this, the size of noble holdings contracted. And an interesting side effect, which I will discuss in greater detail in another video, is that some poorer landowners who could not maintain their holdings sold land and titles to urban merchants who were looking to enter into the aristocracy. We also see the lesser nobility moving to the cities as they were no longer able to maintain their lands through rent. But back to the topic at hand. There was a benefit to the landed elites to pay wages. This allowed them to collect rent as money instead of relying on agrarian markets. They could then use this to pay for their wars and maintain their lifestyles. This too benefited the state, who would be able to collect taxes in the form of money. An additional effect of this is that the aristocracy became more aligned with the state politically, where once it was independent and more often at odds with the state. In France, the state started to compensate nobility for the loss of incomes in the forms of pensions, so as to maintain the basis of its military forces, the knights. For the farming peasants, they were able to invest in the land and increase productivity, as they now had a surplus and the know-how to do so, where before the feudal lords had neither the skill nor the desire to do so. In England, this led to the creation of the agrarian capitalist, who both owned their own labour and sold the value from it. So, where is the crisis? The crisis is the stagnation of the productivity of the ruling classes and their inability to support the increasing cost of their lifestyle. The medieval elites did not innovate. Sure, rulers did innovate and try to change things, but the feudal system was predicated on the collection of taxes from the labour of the peasants. The issue is that all the peasants owned was their own labour, but they were the most heavily taxed portion in medieval society. From the extraction of rents, taxes and tithes, the most common way that the peasant was able to provide payment was either with their labour or payment in crops. With the drop in productivity of the land, the inflation of the market, and finally the rise of wages post-Black Death, feudal lords could not maintain their social position and the basis of feudalism. This is one of the contradictions of feudalism, that where the feudal lord must provide protection to their tenants. The peasants' taxes were not just to live on the land, but to ensure the upkeep of the manor and the feudal lord's armies. This agreement also bound the feudal lord to the king, who had the obligation to provide taxes and manpower in the event of war. However, with the never-ceasing wars of the 14th century, coupled with the rising costs of war, how could the feudal lords maintain the men, horses, arms, armour, castles, on top of a diminishing income stream? All this led to the erosion of the power of the feudal structure. The feudal lord, who relied on the peasant classes to maintain their privileged status and wealth, could no longer do so. The peasant, who relied on the feudal lord for protection, found this relationship no longer to be fit for purpose. The very basis of feudalism was beginning to erode. Feudalism's decline was slow. It did not just die out in the late medieval period. It took centuries to dissolve as the middle class developed into the powerhouse of social and political change to create the modern state. But while feudalism collapsed, its replacement was beginning to develop in the gaps of its failure. This was capitalism, And for a while, the two systems coexisted. But eventually, capitalism became the dominant system of economics as the modern state arose. But that, as I say, is a topic for another video. Hi, you're still here. That means you enjoyed the video. Remember, like, comment and subscribe. And stay safe, have fun, and keep reenacting.